Today's daf we're going to be learning is Avodah Zarah daf Mem Tet. We're going to get started with the Mishnah from the previous daf. We learned about planting vegetables under an Asherah tree. And Tanakama had said you can plant them under the Asherah tree in the winter, because in the winter you don't want to benefit from the shade. The shade actually is a detriment to you. And Rabbi Yossi said you also can't, and in the summer obviously the shade is important and therefore not in the summer. Rabbi Yossi said you can't do vegetables even in the winter because the leaves, the foliage that falls is going to work as fertilizer and fertilize your field. To which we said, well, that means, now how is it getting fertilized? From all sorts of things, and this is just part of it. That comes into the category of Zevazeh Gorim. So it looks like the machloket in the Mishnah between the rabbis and Rabbi Yossi is, rabbis say Zevazeh Gorim is permitted and they don't have a problem with it. And Rabbi Yossi says Zevazeh Gorim is forbidden. Now, this raised a big problem because in a different sugya with the shochek and zoreh la ruach, if you remember, Rabbi Yossi said you destroy the idols and scatter it to the wind, which means it then fertilizes the soil. And it sounds like Rabbi Yossi holds that's fine because Zevazeh Gorim is permitted. And the rabbis specifically said, how could you do that? It's going to fertilize the ground. It seems like their positions are switched. So one of the resolutions we have was to actually say, yes, their positions are switched. Another option was to say, it depends on we said that Rabbi Yossi, we can explain the contradiction, because it goes li'ibud. It basically goes to nowhere when you scatter it, or you want to destroy it. We had a few different interpretations, whereas when the foliage falls on the ground, it goes right there and it's not trying to, disappear kind of thing, or be eradicated. Now, then we said, what about the contradiction of the rabbis with the rabbis? Well, they said, like Rav Mary Bereder HaKahana said, which basically, what in the end they explained, Zevazeh Gorim based on the sugya with the Zevel, in the other case with the scattering the little pieces of the little dust from the idols, that's forbidden because of Zevazeh Gorim. But in our case, it's going to be permitted because it actually doesn't really even benefit, because what happens, and now I want to correct one small thing I said wrong yesterday, which is, in the end, what the foliage falls, and while that might fertilize the ground and that's seen as benefit, while it's on the ground, and it's actually said the reverse before, while it's on the ground, it's actually shading the ground, which isn't good for us in the winter months. We don't want the shade, and therefore the benefits outweigh each other, and there's actually no benefit. Because there's no benefit, it's permitted, right? There's no problem, because you can do it and you don't have to worry about that, because we don't care about that kind of benefit. So that's how we resolved it. But then the Gemara had another problem. The Gemara said, wait a minute. The problem the Gemara now has is that Rabbi Yossi actually says in a different sugya that Zevazeh Gorim is forbidden, because the way we've explained it now, if we don't switch the positions and say that our Mishnah has who said what wrong, but we stick with the original and resolve the contradiction and claim each case is different, we end up concluding that Zevazeh Gorim is permitted according to Rabbi Yossi. But, Zevazeh Gorim is forbidden according to Rabbi Yossi. That's how Rabbi Yossi appears on the Mishnah. And just in the other case, right, it was going to be destroyed, and that's why, but really Zevazeh Gorim is forbidden. The problem is, in the Orla Sugya, if you remember, we took these Orla shoots that you can plant in the ground, but you can't plant in the ground the Orla fruit itself, right? They were using a case of a walnut. And Rav Yehuda said in the name of Rav that Modeh Rabbi Yossi Shim Natavi Vrich V'Yarkiv Mutar. I'll just point out, by the way, the explanation I gave in our previous class is the way the Ritva understands it. Rashi understands it a little differently, but if you plant the nut and graft it with a tree, or with a different tree, or with another shoot, put a shoot in the ground with it to grow, it's permitted. Which seems to be because Zevazeh Gorim is permitted. And now we're really stuck, because Rabbi Yossi really does seem to say that Zevazeh Gorim is permitted. And we're going to start now with the last few words of Mem Chet Amabet. V'tanya Namihachi, and another bright supports that and says, Modeh Rabbi Yossi, Shim Nata, V'Ivrich, V'Yarkiv, Mutal. Okay, if you did that, it's permitted. Same thing. If you want to say, maybe Rabbi Yossi distinguishes between other Isurim and Avodah Zarah. Maybe Orla, he's lenient, but Zevazeh Gorim and Avodah Zarah will be strict, and that's a possibility. But Umishanele. But we don't see that Rabbi Yossi does that because we're going to quote another source, Hatanya. Now, this is going to be a little bit of a long argument because what they're going to say is there's a machloket in this braita between two braitot, and we're going to assume one is Rabbi Yossi, one is the rabbis, and then we're going to assume it fits in with the previous of the Zoreh Ruach, where Rabbi Yossi wasn't really so concerned, and the rabbis were concerned, and therefore Rabbi Yossi must be the one who permits, and the rabbis are the ones who forbid. That's basically where we're going. It's going to be long because after that we're going to say maybe it's not Rabbi Yossi and the rabbis, and eventually we're going to come back to it is Rabbi Yossi and the rabbis because there's no one else it could be. But we'll get there. It'll take us a while to get there. So now they're going to say, they want to prove right now that Rabbi Yossi also says the same thing and permits it even in Avodah Zarah cases. And then we really don't have an argument. If you fertilize a field with fertilizer that's Avodah Zarah. Now again, fertilizing a field is always going to have other things mixed in, like the soil. So it's going to be a case of zev zegorim. You used vetch of Avodah Zarah, that's what the animals eat, and you fattened up a cow with it. So the cow benefited from the Avodah Zarah. You can plant in the field, and you can slaughter the cow. Tanya Idach, a different writer says, Sadeh tavur upara tarzeh. The sadeh has to be lay fallow. You can't benefit from it. And the cow needs to get thinned out before you can do anything with it. You have to basically undo the benefits that you got. My love, Rabbi Yossi, Rabbanan. So now they're going to say, right, in both those cases, now the cow fattened up, but not just because of the vetch. There were other things that contributed. So both of these are cases of zev zegorim. One source says permitted, one source says forbidden. Won't we just assume that fits into Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda? One says yes, one says no. Rabbi Yossi from the sugya again of scattering, and where the rabbi said, what do you mean? It's going to fertilize. And Rabbi Yossi says, no problem. Must mean Rabbi Yossi permits, the rabbis forbid, and we're back to square one. This means Rabbi Yossi doesn't hold zev zegorim, which doesn't match Rabbi Yossi in our Mishnah, and we're back in a problem. So they say, no, lo, ha-Rabbi Eliezer, ha-Rabbanan. We can say it wasn't Rabbi Yossi and the rabbis, it was Rabbi Eliezer and the rabbis. Who's Rabbi Eliezer and the rabbis? Hey, Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbanan, which Rabbi Eliezer, which, not necessarily which Rabbi Eliezer, but which opinion of Rabbi Eliezer and which opinion of the rabbis? Ilema, if you want to say always gets rejected, if you want to say we're going to basically bring two possible explanations of a machloket, Rabbi Eliezer and the rabbis, and try to say this is the machloket. In the end, we're going to reject it and go back to saying it must be Rabbi Yossi and the rabbis, and then back to our big question. But to try to resolve the question, they're going to try to say maybe it's not Rabbi Yossi and the rabbis, maybe it's someone else, and then if we don't say it's Rabbi Yossi and the rabbis, we can say that maybe Rabbi Yossi says zev zegorim is forbidden when it comes to Avodah Zarah, but permitted in other cases, and then we have no contradiction. So they say, Ilema, if you're going to say Rabbi Eliezer Rabbanan of Se'or. Okay, Se'or is a leavening agent. Ditnan, if you have Se'or, it says in the Mishnah, you have Se'or shel chulin v'shel truma. You have a little bit of chulin, of this leavening agent, and you have some of truma. Now, they both together leavened the bread. Shenaflu l'toch isa, so they both fell into the dough. Lo bezeh kedei l'chametz, v'lo bezeh kedei l'chametz. Neither one is enough to actually make the bread leaven, turn it into bread. V'nitztarfu, v'chimtzu, but together, they join together and they actually cause the bread to leaven, to rise. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, achar acharon ani ba. So now the question is, since it's chulin and truma together, do we say it's truma and forbidden to anyone other than a kohen, or do we say it's chulin? So Rabbi Eliezer says we go by the last one. And Chachamim oblim, bein shenafal isur lechatchila, bein shenafal isur levasof. It doesn't matter if the isur was there first, the truma, or the truma was there second. The order makes no difference. Eino asur ad sheyebo kedei lechametz. You have to have each one on its own could have leavened, or let's say if we want to say it's forbidden, the truma had to have been enough to leaven it. If the truma there wasn't enough truma of enough of the leavening agent to leaven it by itself, and only was the combination of the two, we're not going to forbid the loaf of bread. The Amar Abai. Now, here comes the explanation of the machloket according to Abai, and then we're going to say, okay, this can't be. Now, Amar Abai. Lo shanu ela, shekadam v'silek etaisu. So now, this is going to be we're going to use Abaye to prove that the machloket, Rabbi Eliezer and the rabbis, is zev zegorim. That's what we're going to try to do, and then we'll say, maybe that's the Rabbi Eliezer and the rabbis, that those two different Braito fit in, and each one matches a different opinion. So Abaye said, Lo shanu ela shekadam v'silek etaisu. We're only talking about, in this case, where you actually took out the isur. Okay, meaning when we're going to say it's permitted because the leavening agent of the chulin was last, that's only if you took out the truma, okay, before it leavened. But if you didn't take it out, then it's actually forbidden. Okay, so now, now we're going to say the following. If you didn't take out the isur, then Rabbi Eliezer is going to say you have two things here. You have heter and isur together, and the two of them is what leavened it, because there wasn't enough in either one of them. And the isur is still there, right? If the isur is still there, we're going to forbid it. We're only going to permit if the isur was taken out. If isur is still there and the two of them together are leavening it, zev zegorim, heter, isur, we're going to say asur. That's Rabbi Eliezer. And the rabbis say, no, we won't do that. Only if the isur has enough in and of itself to leaven the bread. So it must be zev zegorim is mutar, and then we'd say, Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbanan. However, the Gemara is going to reject this and say, if you remember, you might not remember anymore, this was Abaye's explanation of the machloket. So the Gemara says that's only going to work if we go with Abaye's explanation. Umimai d'tamid de Rabbi Eliezer kida Abaye. Who's to say that Abaye is right? Dilma tamid de Rabbi Eliezer mishum de'achar chahon aniba. Igamar b'isura asura v'igamar be'atera mutarim. Maybe Rabbi Eliezer just holds that whatever the last thing, because why is the last thing important? Because if it weren't for the last thing, it would never have leavened. The first one doesn't have enough to leaven on its own. It's the last one that in the end was the one that made it happen. So maybe his approach is to say, we go by the last one, whichever one it is, because that's what actually made it happen. So made it leaven. So again, Igam Rabbi Isur, if you finish with Isur, with the Truma, it's forbidden. If you finish with the Heter, with the Chulin, it's permitted. Bein silkua, bein lo silkua, right? Bein salke, bein lo salke. Whether you took it out or whether you didn't take it out, that's irrelevant, right? And that's Rabbi Eliezer. In which case, that has nothing to do with zev zegorim. It has to do with a totally different thing. In which case, it's irrelevant for our purposes. Okay, so let's try a second attempt of Rabbi Eliezer. Elav Rabbi Eliezer v'Rabbanan de'etzi. In the case of trees. What's the case? Ditnan, it says in the Mishnah, Natal hemena etzim. Okay, we're talking, it's actually the next Mishnah, not the next one, but actually the next Mishnah. Okay? Natal mimena etzim. If you take trees, you take wood from the Asherah tree. Okay, now, the Mishnah is going to continue and say, so asura bahana. Any wood you take from the tree is forbidden to benefit from. Let's say you lit up a fire, an oven with it. Chadash yutat. So now we're going to have three possibilities of what you did with it. Either it was a brand new oven, which needed to, when you have an oven that you make, let's say, out of an earthenware vessel, and then you fire it up, it actually completes the making of the vessel. If you did that, the vessel itself was created through this fire that you're not allowed to benefit from the wood, so yutat, you have to completely destroy the oven. Yashan, if it was old, and it doesn't need firing up for its own sake, the oven's in perfect shape without it, but you heated up a fire in the oven, yutzan, you just leave it to cool off, and then you can light it up again, because whatever you had there is turned to ash, it's nothing, and you're not going to benefit from it at all. Afabo etapat, if you cooked bread with it in that oven, with the firewood going from the Asherah tree, asura b'hana'ah. Well, that bread was made from Asherah fire, so you can't benefit from the bread. Nit arva ba'achirim kulam asura b'hana'ah. If it got mixed up with other ones, meaning you had this loaf of bread that was made with the Asherah, and it got mixed up with regular loaves of bread, kulam asura b'hana'ah. All of them are forbidden to benefit from because we have no idea which one is the Asherah. It's Avodah Zarah. It's not batel, not nullified. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Yolichan al Yam HaMelech. Okay, we'll go with the interpretation that Rabbi Eliezer is referring to. It's a bit of a debate about this. To a case where it's in a mixture now. You have 10 loaves of bread. One of them is the Asherah. You don't know which one. So what do? We don't want to forbid 10 breads, 10 loaves. So what do? You take the value of one loaf, you throw that money into the Yam HaMelech, into the Dead Sea. You basically waste that money and say, now I can eat the bread because I'm not benefiting from the bread because I took that money and I threw it in the Dead Sea. That was the value. This is like redeeming it, basically. And the rabbis say, Amru lo, ein pidyon avodah zarah. You can't redeem avodah zarah. So now we're going to say, Rabbi Eliezer, he forbids this. Now let's look at the bread. The bread was made with avodah zarah heat, right? But it was the oven also contributed to the baking of the bread. So was zev gorem. And what does Rabbi Eliezer say? It's forbidden. You have to redeem it, right? Obviously that's because it's forbidden. Now the rabbis also agree here you have to redeem it. Because they both agree you have to redeem it. The rabbis even go farther and say it can't even be redeemed. It's forbidden completely. So they both actually think it's forbidden, and that's why the Gemara now says, Rabbanan de pliga le Rabbi Eliezer mainin. Who are the rabbis then who disagree with Rabbi Eliezer? In other words, we said, again, going way back, we had those two bright about the field and about the cow, and one said you can use them, and one said you can't. And then, right, until there's no benefit anymore from what you used. And we said, one is Rabbi Eliezer, one is the rabbi. So we found Rabbi Eliezer's position, but who's the rabbis? So they say, right, if you're going to say, Ilam or Rabbanan de Eitzim, if it's the rabbis here, Achmurim Achmure, they're even more Machmir. They said not only is it forbidden, you can't even redeem it. So it definitely isn't that. Ela Rabbanan de Seol, if it's the rabbis of the Seor, the leavening case, Amar de Shamat Lula Rabbanan de Mekile de Seol, Bavodah Zarah mi Mekile. Just because the rabbis are lenient when it comes to the bread doesn't mean they're going to be lenient for idol worship. And then we don't have a rabbi's position to fit in here with the position of it's permitted. Because remember, if you want to take the rabbis from the Rabbi Yossi debate, well, the rabbis there actually said it's permitted. They said it's forbidden. So that's like Rabbi Eliezer, it's forbidden. So we don't have a position of the rabbis here, or not a clear-cut position of a rabbinic position that would forbid, because just because they forbid in Seor doesn't mean, we're looking for a position of the rabbis that permits, and we don't have it, because even if they permit in Seor, it doesn't necessarily mean they're going to permit in Avodah Zarah. Ela la'olam ha'Rabbi Yossi ha'Rabbanan. So we're back to square one. There's no other way, there's no other machloket we know other than the machloket Rabbi Yossi and the rabbis. Scatter it to the wind. That's Rabbi Yossi, it's permitted. The rabbis who say, what do you mean? You're fertilizing the land, it's forbidden. And we're back to square one because that contradicts our Mishnah. Remember, the rabbi said, no problem that your leaves fall down. And Rabbi Yossi said, it's a problem that your leaves are falling down. They're fertilizing the ground. Completely opposite. So how do we resolve this? Well, we have a now creative way. Again, we tried the ipuch, which is a possibility, but they don't want to do that. Switch who said what in our Mishnah. Now they suggest, when Rabbi Yossi's talking in the Mishnah, Rabbi Yossi l'divreihem de Rabbanan ka'amal. There's a word missing here, ka'amal. The Rabbi Yossi says, I'm speaking according to the opinion of the rabbis. In other words, this happens a lot in Mishnayot, or certainly when we get to a bit of a complicated one that doesn't make sense. Say, maybe they're just playing devil's advocate to the other position. Rabbi Yossi says, Amar lehu, l'didi zev zegorem mutar. He said to the rabbis, listen, I think zev zegorem is permitted. But lididhu, so I agree with you, really, that you can plant the vegetables. It's no problem, because even if the leaves fall, it doesn't make a difference. That's going to fertilize. But lididhu, damaritu, zev zegorem aser. But you bother me the other time about the position of the zevel. So why are you worried about the zevel here? About the fertilizer, the leaves falling and fertilizing. O delimiat, at least admit to me, then that the af yirakopi and morak shamim, the vegetables in the morak shamim should be a problem according to your opinion. V'Rabbanan, and what are the rabbis going to answer? Why aren't they concerned, even though they are concerned in the other case? Well, that we already explained, Keda'amar Rav Meri B'rei Rav Kahana, because they don't think it's actually benefit. Because even though the leaves fall and fertilize, the leaves are also now covering the crops, and they're preventing the sun from getting there, and that's bad for the crops. So in the end, it's a zero-sum game. There's no benefit. There's no benefit, of course, it's not going to be forbidden. And therefore, you can plant the vegetables and not worry about this issue. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel Halachat Ke Rabbi Yossi. And Rabbi Yehuda said the name of Shmuel, we actually paskin like Rabbi Yossi, Zev Zegorem is actually permitted. And Ahu Ginata Di Zaba Bezibla de Avodah Zarah. There was a garden that used fertilizer from Avodah Zarah. Shalach Rav Amram Kamei to Rav Yosef, and Rav Amram sent before Rav Yosef. Like, what should we do? Amar lehachi Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel. This is what Rav Yehuda said in the name of Shmuel. Halacha ke Rabbi Yossi. It's permitted. Okay? Very straight and clear. Now we get to the next Mishnah, starting on Amud Bet. And this already we saw the beginning of this Mishnah. Natal mimenu eitzim. If you took wood from the tree, asurim b'hana'ah, they're forbidden to benefit from. Hisik b'ematatanor. If you went ahead then and lit up the flame lit up a fire in the oven. Im chadash yutatz. If it's new, you have to break it to pieces because you created the oven with this fire. Im yashan. If it's old, yutzan. Just leave it to cool down. If you bake bread, the bread is forbidden to benefit from. If they mix in with others, they're all forbidden to benefit from, because now we don't know which is the forbidden one. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Yolichan Ali Yamamelach, redeem it onto money, take the money and put it in Yamamelach, in the Dead Sea. Amrulo, Ein Podin Avodah Zarah. And they said to him, you can't redeem Avodah Zarah, it doesn't work that way, they're still all forbidden. Now, that we already had seen. Now we're going to see the same thing, but with a kirkor. A kirkor is a wood stick that they took from a tree. It kind of had a pointy side to it, and they would use it in the weaving loom to kind of straighten out the strands. So natali menu kirkor. If you took off a kirkor, you basically broke off a piece of the tree, and it could use it as your kirkor. It's a shuttle, by the way. In English, asul b'hana'ah. You can't benefit from it again because it's asherah, which was avodah zarah. A rag bo et habeged. If you wove a clothing with it, it's exactly like the bread. Then, obviously, asur b'hana'ah, because you used something that was forbidden to benefit from. Nitarev ba'achirim. And here the Girsa says achirim ba'achirim. If that clothing, mixed up with other clothing, and then that one from that batch that was forbidden mixed up with another batch, kulam asurim b'hana'ah. There's no bitul here. Okay, it's made from avodah zarah. There's nothing you could do. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, yolichan ali yamamelach. By the way, some people don't have the girsa achirim b'achirim, and some people actually have it. I think also in the first case. It's not like it's supposed to be a difference from the first case. It's really all one and the same. It depends on what version you have, though. Yolichan ali. So again, Rabbi Eliezer says yolichan ali yamamelach. Right, take the value of one of the items of clothing, throw it in the Dead Sea, and then you're permitted to use all of them. Amrulo, Ein Podim Avodah Zarah, and they say you can't redeem Avodah Zarah. Same exact thing, just a different case. Which the Gemara says, obviously, why do you need both cases? Utsricha, you need both cases. Why? If you had the first case, you might have said, with the bread, Bahakam or Rabbi Eliezer, Mishum de bi idana de kagam rapat kali le isura. What happens with the bread? When you make the bread, by the time the bread is ready, your isser is no longer there. It became ashes. It's nothing. There's nothing left to it. So you don't even have isur anymore. So maybe that's why Rabbi Eliezer is going to be lenient and say you can redeem the isser, because isser is just now the bread was made from isser, which isn't even in existence anymore. Aval kirkor d'ite l'isur be'enei ema modeh l'rabanan. But the shuttle, since it still exists, even though obviously it's not in the clothing, but the actual implement that you did, there was usher that you used, that still exists. So maybe we'd be more strict and we wouldn't say you could just redeem the clothing because the isser is still existing. And for the same token, right, and maybe that for the Rabbanan, maybe they agree with the rabbis that you can't redeem it. And kirkur, if you just had the shuttle, you would have said, Bahaka Amrei Rabbanan. That's when the rabbis said, in the shuttle case. Aval pat ema modele Rabbi Eliezer. But when it comes to bread, maybe they'll agree with Rabbi Eliezer. In other words, it's the same logic. In the kirkur, the rabbis say you can't redeem it, but maybe they think you can redeem in the bread because, again, the isser is not in existence anymore. Aval, right? And therefore it's tzricha. Amar Rabbi Chia Berei Rabba Bar Nachmani, Amar Rav Chisda, Amar Ze'eri, Halacha ki Rabbi Eliezer. We paskin like Rabbi Eliezer, actually, that you can redeem it. And Ikeda Amre, some people say Amar Rav Chisda, Amar Li Abba Bar Rav Chisda, Hachi Amar Ze'eri, Halacha ki Rabbi Eliezer. So again, we have a bit of a debate about who said what and whose name, but in the end, we have both versions basically say we paskin like Rabbi Eliezer. Amar Rav Ada Bar Ahava, Lo Shanu Ela Pat. Now he says, this is all true. In the case of bread, that Rabbi Eliezer will allow this and will paskin like him. you can redeem it. But chavit, lo. That's because the pot, okay, let's talk about what we're comparing. The bread that was made with the flames that were, the fire that came from the wood from Avodah Zarah, but there's actually no Avodah Zarah item in the bread itself, right? The bread itself just was made with Avodah Zarah, nothing tangible. But chavit, if you had a barrel of yain nesach, for example, and it got mixed up with the other ones, you can't redeem that, okay? Because there, the wine is in existence. The wine itself is problematic, and it's there. It's something tangible. For Rav Chisda Amar, afilu chavit muter. Rav Chisda actually rules even the barrel you can redeem. Okay, he takes Rabbi Eliezer even farther, or we don't know what Rabbi Eliezer himself said, but he thinks that we could take it that far. Now we're just going to have a case where we see that Rav Chisda paskened exactly like he said, and permitted even wine to be redeemed. So we have a person that got mixed up his barrel with yain nesach. So one of his barrels was yain nesach. Bechamre, we got mixed up with other wines. Ata l'kamei Rav Chisda, he came before Rav Chisda. Amar, so Rav Chisda told him, Shkol arba zuzei ushtei benarav v'nishterei. Take 4 zuzim, throw it in the river, and we'll permit your wine. New Mishnah. Ketzad mevatla. If you have an asherah tree, what makes, if we see a Gentile, remember, only a Gentile can nullify the Avodah Zarah. So what actions can the Gentile do that will be indicative that the Gentile doesn't intend for this to be Avodah Zarah anymore? Kirseim v'zired. Okay, one is cutting the dry leaves off of there, the dry twigs. One is cutting wet, moist leaves off of there, or twigs, or branches. Natal mimenu makel o sharvi. He took off, and taking off anything from the tree shows that the Gentile doesn't view this as a god anymore. Otherwise, why would he be taking things off the tree? So if you took a staff or a scepter from it, afilu aleh, even just a leaf, okay? Anything you take from there, what they mean by a makel or a scepter, they mean like a piece of wood from there. Harezo b'tela. So even just by taking a leaf, basically they're showing we don't want to use this anymore. Shifa, if he shaves off some of the tree, litzarka asura, shelo litzarka muteret. If he's doing it for the purpose of the tree, to make the tree nicer, then the tree is still forbidden, because it was just to make the gods look, the idol look nicer. If it was not for the sake of the tree, then it's muteret, because why would you be shaving off something from this idol? Otan shfa'in, the Gemara asks, these shreds now that you shredded off the tree, matei alehem, because they're kind of broken pieces from an idol. So what's their status? Like, let's say you took it off to make the idol nicer. So the chipped off pieces, do they have, Avodah Zarah sanctity to them? Okay? We already learned this, by the way, and we said they don't, but we're going to see there's a machloket. Rav Huna v'Rabbi Chia bar Rav disagree about this. Chanamar asurim, v'chanamar mutarim. One said it's forbidden, one said it's permitted. Tanya commanda amar mutarim. Okay, now we're going to bring a braita, and this is the exact braita we quoted earlier. You might remember this. That said, they're permitted. Tanya, as it says in a braita. If a Gentile shaves off some of his idol for his or her own purpose, obviously the person doesn't care about the idol anymore because they're using it for their own purpose, and therefore nullify the idol, and therefore it's all permitted, everything. The shavings and obviously the idol, which is no longer an idol. Litzarka, if the Gentile was doing it to make the idol look nicer, the idol itself is forbidden, but the shavings are permitted because they're just like garbage at this point. Yisrael, so that proves basically that they're permitted. Yisrael sheshifa avodah zarah. Now a Jew who does this, bein letzarka or bein letzarko, he ushvaya salim. The Jew doesn't have any capabilities to nullify an idol, and therefore anything the Jew does, it doesn't matter. Everything is still forbidden because it's all part of the idol. Itmar. That wasn't important. That was just part of the Braita. Anyway, the Braita was brought to prove the one opinion that said it was permitted. But there is another opinion that said it's forbidden. Itmar. Now we're going to quote a machloka between Rav and Shmuel, but it's not going to be so clear right away what they argue about. Avodah zarah shenishtabra. And in fact, the Hagahot Bach adds the word me'eleha. It was Avodah Zarah that broke on its own. Rav Amar, tzarich levatel kol kesam v'kesam. Every little piece of wood that came off, let's say it was a tree, that broke, fell down, So every little piece of wood needs to be nullified. The sanctity, so to speak, it's not really sanctity, right? But it's the idol's sanctity that the Gentiles view it, the pagans view it as having sanctity. That is forbidden unless it's nullified. Ushmuel amar avodah zarah ina b'tela ela derech gedei lata. Okay, he says this very unclear statement. Avodah zarah is not nullified, Shmuel says this, but in the way it grows. Sounds like when it falls in the way that it grows, then it's nullified, which doesn't really make much sense. In fact, the Gemara is going to say it would be the opposite. Adrabah, derech gedei lata mivadla. We talked before about the leaves falling from the tree. That's their normal way of doing it. Nobody nullified them, so why would we say that's nullified, right? They just fell in their normal way. That's not nullification. Elahachi kamar. So they say, okay, this is really what he meant. Ein avodah zarah tzricha levatel ela derech gedei lata. Meaning, any avodah zarah that breaks is gone. It's not an idol anymore, because again, we saw this in the words of Rish Lakish a long time ago, which is, Rish Lakish will say, if the idol couldn't help himself and broke, obviously that idol's not going to help me, and therefore obviously nullified it. So the only one that you need nullification for is actually if it falls derech gedei lata, like leaves that fall from this Asherah tree, because right, nobody thought, right, it didn't have any sort of breaking at all. That's just its normal, natural way of being. So lema b'hakam b'flagei. Let's think about what might be the root of their machloket. Let's suggest Demar savar ovdin l'shvarim, umar savar ein ovdin l'shvarim. Rav holds people still worship even broken pieces, and Shmuel thinks no, they don't, and that's why Shmuel says broken pieces are gone unless they break in their normal way. But if they break on their own, some other unnatural manner, well, no one's going to worship those anymore. Rav thinks people do. So the Gemara says, "Lo, that's not their machlok." Everybody thinks the broken pieces of idols actually are worshipped. We're talking about very small broken pieces. Like once it breaks up into really little pieces, Mar savar shivrei shvarim asurim, Shmuel thinks they're still forbidden, Umar savar shivrei shvarim mutarim, and Rav thinks they're permitted. V'ibay de'ema, or alternatively, dekule alma shivrei shvarim mutarim. Maybe everybody thinks little broken pieces are permitted. Nobody's going to think that people still worship little teeny pieces. Now they start saying that maybe the machloket has to do with something else. It's talking about something that broke, but something that's in pieces, kind of like a Lego you built and then the Lego falls apart. But anyone can really put that together. That's what they mean by a hedyot yachol lachzira. It's just little pieces that kind of fit into each other. So it broke, but someone could easily put it back together. So Mar savar kevan hedyot yachol lachzira lo batla. Rav thinks that since it can be very easily put back together, it's not nullified. Umar savar ein avodah zarah b'tela ela gederech gedei lata tahainu orche halav gedei lata ve'ein shricha libatel. So Shmuel thinks avodah zarah is not nullified unless it's derech gedei lata, okay, which is its normal way. And this was not lav gedei latai ve'enat shricha bitul. In other words, this didn't break in its normal way. If it breaks in its normal way, then it needs bitul. If not, it's going to stay avodah zarah. But this one, since it, even though it's chuliot and you can easily put it back together, but it broke in some random way, not in any natural way, and therefore it's going to basically be nullified. We're going to assume because it broke. Who cares that someone can put it back together? It broke. And that already is an indicator that this Elil, this idol, doesn't have much power. And with that, we finish the chapter. Hadran alach kol atzlami. And now we start with Rabbi Yishmael and Markulis. If you remember, Markulis says it starts with 3 stones, and then people throw stones at it, and it becomes bigger and bigger and bigger. So Rabbi Yishmael omer, shalosh avanim zo b'tzad zo. If you have 3 rocks, one near the other, which is the minimum size of a Markulis, b'tzad Markulis, but these are next to a Markulis, asurot, they're forbidden. Ushtayim mutarot. So you have this markulis, and then you have these 3 stones next to it, or 2 stones next to it. If it's 3, we're going to forbid them. And if it's 2, we're going to permit it. We don't really understand right now why he makes this distinction. Chachamim obrim, they have something a little bit more intuitive, which is shenirot imo asurot, she'enirot imo mutarot. If they can be seen with the markulis, meaning they're near it, we can assume they came from there. And therefore they're forbidden because they came from the Avodah Zarah. If they're far away, then we assume the stones could have just been stones, not necessarily connected to markulis. So if they can't be seen with markulis, then they're permitted. Not having anything to do with 2, 3 numbers. So the Gemara starts off and says, Bishlama Rabbanan Kasavar Ovdin L'Shvarim. Niroti Modi Kalamemar Mine Nafala Surot. Niroti Mo Mutarot. So the rabbis hold people worship broken pieces. And it's just a question of if they're seen with it, then they must be broken pieces of the idol. If they're not seen with it, then they're not broken pieces of the idol. So even though broken pieces could be worshipped, these aren't broken pieces from an idol. It's only broken pieces from an idol that are a problem. Ela Rabbi Yishmael my kasavar. But what does Rabbi Yishmael hold? If people worship broken pieces, afilu tartenani litzar, then even 2 should be forbidden. And if people don't worship broken pieces, afilu tlatnami lo, well then even 3 shouldn't be forbidden. Amar Rabbi Yitzchak bar Yosef, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. So now he's going to try to explain. Now first he's actually we're not going to even get to the machloket today. We're going to get to what they all agree about. So, when we know that they for sure fell from this markulis, everyone agrees it's forbidden. And even if you say people don't worship broken pieces, that's not relevant in this case. Why? Because Avodah Zarah de lav hainu orchin. Broken pieces are if you have an idol, that's let's say a statue, and the statue falls and breaks into pieces. That's when we're going to assume people still worship them. People don't worship broken pieces because they're broken pieces from an idol, and who's going to worship some smashed idol? Aval hacha, but in our case, 3 stones or 2 stones next to markulis, de meikara tabure mitabre hainu orche. From the beginning, they're separate pieces. This isn't a broken piece. This is all these stones that were together, and now some separated. But they're not really considered broken pieces. They're not broken. It was already broken. The whole markulis is built like this, as separate pieces that are just in a pile. So this would then be forbidden. So now we're going to have to wait till tomorrow to see kiplige, what actually is their machloket, and we'll come back to this. So what we did today is we started with the sugya of Rabbi Yossi and the rabbis. Zev Zegorim is Rabbi Yossi, the one who says it's permitted, and the rabbis say it's forbidden, which is what we saw from a different sugya, but it didn't seem to match our Mishnah. In the end, we finally, after all the long-winded arguments, we finally said, Rabbi Yossi must be speaking according to the rabbis, but not in his own voice. Saying, even you, though, who said this, should agree, based on what you say elsewhere, that this case would be forbidden, and basically the rabbis say, oh no, we view this not as any benefit, and that's why we permit it. Not because we do hold Zev Zegorim as Asher, we just don't think this is Zev Zegorim. Because there's no benefit. So it's true, it's Heter and Isser together, but there's no real benefit, because the benefit of the fertilizer is counterbalanced by the shade, which they don't want. And then we said how we pass like Rabbi Yossi, that Zev Zegorim is permitted, and from there we move to an Eitz Asherah that has broken pieces, right, that if you took parts off of it, then they're forbidden. And then, if you do something with it, then you end up with this item that was made from idol worship and it's forbidden. And then we talked about why there's 2 cases in the Mishnah, what we learned from each one, and how the pot compares to a case of Nesach, for example, that got mixed up with others. We talked about Dine Bitul, or lack of in this case. Okay, then we went to then we went to the Mishnah about how a Gentile nullifies Eitz Asherah, all sorts of indicators that they don't want to use it as a god anymore. And then we talked about what we do with the shreddings. If they shred it, are they permitted or forbidden? And from there we got to Avodah Zarah that broke on its own, and this machloket Rav and Shmuel that took us a little while to understand what exactly the source of the debate is. And from there we got to this machloket Rabbi Shmuel and the rabbis, which we haven't yet exactly figured out what their machloket is about. And with that, we'll continue tomorrow. Wishing everyone a good day.